We turn now to a discussion of deontological theories that are neither act-deontological nor absolutist rule deontological. These are referred to as objectivist rule deontological theories. Recall that deontological theories include any theory of morality that asserts that the rightness of an action is determined by its conformity to duty. Butler, for example, as an act deontologist, would say that if your conscience tells you to do X, then you have a moral obligation to do X. If that changes in a different context and your conscience tells you to do the opposite of X, then that becomes your moral obligation. It becomes your duty irrespective of what the consequences might be. Kant, too, as an absolutist, who's a rule deontologist, would say that if lying is wrong, then this means that it's always wrong. It's your duty to refrain from ever lying in any given situation. Again, it just comes from that Greek word deon, which indirectly refers to this notion of something being a must or a should. You do it because it's right, you refrain from doing it because it's wrong. Deontological theories, again, by way of review, stress the act. They stress the just resolution of conflicts and the maintaining of order, and they're known as these non-consequential approaches. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, what distinguishes deontological theories from a consequential approach, just as an example, is that they are non-naturalistic. Kant would say that sometimes doing the right thing actually runs contrary to what your natural inclinations might be. Forms, just by way of review, of deontological theories. The act deontological approach that we discussed previously was Joseph Butler's appeal to just referring to your conscience or your intuitions as being your primary guide. This, we said, is referred to as a kind of act deontological approach because the action might change. In one context, Butler might say your moral obligation is to tell the truth. In another situation, your moral obligation is to tell a lie. You're not appealing to rules. You're not appealing to principles. Kant, on the other hand, was a rule deontologist. Beyond that, he was an extreme rule deontologist in that he was an absolutist. According to Kant, if it is wrong to lie, then this means as a general rule or principle, it is always wrong to lie. That's the nature of morality. We're dealing with categorical imperatives. We turn now to a different type of rule deontology. If you found Butler's position lacking and Kant's position too extreme, but still think that a deontological approach is the way to go, you may find that Ross's objectivist rule deontology may be preferable. To understand Ross's rule deontology that's not an absolutist form, but an objectivist form, it might help us to look at a theoretical scenario that was first proposed by Richard Pertil. Richard Pertil talks about Tom Brown, who is a college student, who, because he's a college student, faces multiple financial demands after he has paid for his living expenses at the end of the month. Tom doesn't have a lot of money left over at the end of the month, but he has to decide which of the following needs he really, from a moral perspective, should meet. Tom has a brother named Harry. Tom promised his parents, after his parents passed away, that he'd take care of Harry. Harry, who's also in college, needs $10 for a transfer fee so that he can change dormitory rooms away from a noisy elevator that, due to opening and closing during all hours of the night, is really keeping him awake and keeping him from being successful at college. Tom also knows an individual named Ted, who's an elderly former family handyman that kind of took care of things as he was growing up. Ted has no one else to turn to, and Ted informs Tom that he really needs $10 to tide him over. There's another individual that Tom could choose to help. This individual's name is Ed. He's an elderly community doctor, somebody that grew up in the town that he grew up in as a boy, and Ed really needs to move to the Southwest because of a medical condition. Ed is suffering from asthma, but because he never charged to take care of the poor inhabitants of the town, because he oftentimes gave away his services, and even though he's a doctor, is quite poor, he really doesn't have the money to take a move to the Southwest. Tom was asked to donate $10 to a fund that would help Ed move. Another individual by the name of Dick is Tom's closest friend. Dick needs a $10 loan. He didn't tell Tom why he needed the money, but Tom knows that Dick wouldn't ask for the money unless he really needed it. And then there's Paul. In a moment of weakness, Tom had previously taken a $10 bill that Paul, himself also a poor college student, had left out on his desk. And so Tom really stole some money from Paul. What's his moral obligation to him? And then Tom also realizes that he could use the $10 himself. He's taking an art class, and although a book is not a requirement for the course, there's an art appreciation class that he's taking that could really be assisted if he'd buy this art book. To make the situation even more complex, there's a friend of Tom who's another student in the college that's incredibly wealthy. This man, Peter, is a wealthy student who's living down the hall, and Peter just keeps his full wallet completely out in the open at all times. And because he's so wealthy, he wouldn't even notice or miss if Tom took some of that money to pay some of his expenses. Well, what should Tom do with his limited funds? Just by way of review, what's his moral obligation here? What should he do from an ethical or moral perspective? Should he help out his brother? Should he give Ted, the handyman, some money? Should he help the doctor move to the Southwest because of his asthma? Dick, remember, was his best friend, and he really needs $10. Should he pay back the money that he stole from Paul, or buy that art book for himself? Or how about just, taking care of all of these responsibilities by stealing from Peter? Well, PHIL responds in the following way. PHIL says Tom gritted his teeth and took out a sheet of paper. He would not steal from Peter, even to pay back Paul. If he did that, he might just as well steal from somebody else to pay back Peter, and so on indefinitely. So from Tom's perspective, that doesn't solve anything. What he would do is ask for some overtime work. He knew he could handle it, though it would cut down on the amount of time that he would have in terms of recreation. With the extra money, the first thing that he would do would be to pay back the money that he had stolen from Paul. Even Harry, his brother, would have to wait until he had done that. But of course Harry would have to come next, and he would explain this situation to Dick, his best friend, and Dick would understand. After Harry's fee had been paid, he would then loan Dick the $10. And of course he could pledge $10 toward Dr. Ed's trip if he would just wait until Dick had paid him back, or till the next paycheck, whatever came first. Poor old Ted, remember that old family handyman, would just have to wait a while. But Tom promised himself that he'd help Ted before buying that art appreciation book. Ted wasn't very deserving, he supposed, but he was sick and old and he had no one else to turn to. But if nothing else came up, he might eventually be able to get that book. What PHIL is basically addressing here is this notion that Tom, like almost every individual from just an intuitive perspective, is constantly facing all sorts of rival ethical or moral demands. We might at any given situation have several moral principles that we're going to have to weigh or debate in terms of which one takes the ethical or moral responsibility. Ross believes that he has some kind of a response to this approach. Ross is an intuitionist like Butler, but he's also a deontologist. Now, as far as this goes, Ross is not the only person who believes that these moral principles are just known in an intuitional sort of way. Sidgwick and G.E. Moore and Broad and others would include the kind of person that would think that the moral principles are known intuitively. So don't think that just because somebody's an intuitionist that they think that the moral principles are known intuitively, that means that they're just like Ross. Remember, we said that Butler was an intuitionist, but he clearly wasn't a rule deontologist. He was an act deontologist. Well, Ross is a little bit different. In one respect, he's like Kant, but in another respect, he's like Butler. So don't throw all intuitionists in together in one lump. Ross is a particular kind of intuitionist. He's a rule deontologist. A contemporary proponent of this approach that we'll look at throughout the course of this discussion is an individual who is Robert Audi. Basically, in a nutshell, objectivist rule deontology states that the moral principles, your duties in other words, or your moral obligations are known intuitively. But, and this is how an objectivist differs from an absolutist like Kant, people like Ross are going to say that these moral principles or duties may be legitimately or appropriately overridden when they are in conflict with another superseding moral principle. What do we mean by a superseding moral principle? We mean the one that takes precedence. We mean the one that would override that lower moral obligation. Ross makes a distinction between prima facie duties and other types of duties. The phrase prima facie simply comes from the Latin, and if you look at it, it's fairly straightforward. Prima means first, and facie is just the Latin term or word for face. And so prima facie duties are, literally speaking, according to Ross, first face duties. The way that we might translate that or think about it would be first glance. At first glance or at first blush, when you first examine a specific situation, you might say, well, this is something that I have to do. Another way of thinking about prima facie duties would simply be to refer to them as conditional duties. These are not absolutist duties. These are not duties that one must always perform, but there are certain situations where one is immediately confronted by moral obligations, and oftentimes these moral obligations are in conflict with one another. What are these prima facie duties? Ross lists several. The 7 that he lists would include, first of all, fidelity, the keeping of promises, whether you overtly say, I promise to do this, or just that you've given your word with respect to some kind of a moral duty or an action. Reparation, to correct past wrongs. Gratitude, to repay goodness. Justice, to be fair, to do the right thing, to be just. To be good, beneficence. Self-improvement, to make oneself better. And then finally, to refrain from engaging in acts of harm, non-maleficence. Well, if we look back at that previous theoretical scenario, we can see that each one of those individuals reflects a specific prima facie duty that Ross was addressing. The obligation not to rob Peter was that obligation not to harm. The obligation to repay Paul was due to that moral obligation of paying back. Reparation, helping out Harry, his brother, faithfulness. There's a notion of responsibility there. To loan money to Dick, that's one of gratitude. To help out Ed, to send him to the Southwest, that's just the right thing to do. To help Ted, the old family handyman, well, that's just this notion of doing good for other persons. And then finally, to help himself, that's the moral obligation in terms of self-improvement. According to Ross, these duties or these obligations are obligations or duties that one must follow, and that's why he's a deontologist, unless they are in conflict with a higher moral principle. So he's not appealing to intuitions and just saying let your conscience or your gut always be your guide. Your conscience tells you in a self-evident sort of way what these moral principles are, but your conscience doesn't tell you what you have to do in every given situation. In other words, your conscience is not telling you the act, it's telling you the rule. So these duties are obligations or duties that you must follow unless they are in conflict with a higher moral principles. According to Ross, they are self-evident intuitions. In this respect, he says, it's just like something that you'd find in mathematics or in logic. Mathematical or logical truths are also self-evident intuitions. This is what Ross says, that an act, qua fulfilling a promise. And here, whenever you see a philosopher using the word qua, it's just from the Latin and it means referring to. So that an act with respect to fulfilling a promise, or with respect to effecting a just distribution of good, or with respect to returning services rendered, or with respect to promoting the good of others, or with respect to promoting the virtue or insight of the agent, is prima facie right. It is at first glance the right thing to do. It is self-evident. Not in the sense, and this is key here, that it is evident from the beginning of our lives. That's certainly not what self-evident means. Or as soon as we attend to the proposition for the first time. That's also not what is meant by self-evident. It is self-evident in the sense that when we have reached sufficient mental maturity and have given sufficient attention to the proposition, it is evident without any need of proof or evidence beyond itself. It is self-evident just as a mathematical axiom or the validity of a form of inference is evident. The moral order expressed in these propositions is just as much part of the fundamental nature of the universe, or, we may add, of any possible universe in which there were moral agents at all, as is the spatial or numerical structure expressed in the axioms of geometry or arithmetic. In our confidence that these propositions are true, there is involved the same trust in our reason that is involved in our confidence in mathematics. And we should have no justification for trusting it in the latter sphere and distrusting it in the former. In both cases, according to Ross, we are dealing with propositions that cannot be proved, but that just as certainly need no proof. So this prima facie duty or obligation to tell the truth or to be faithful, according to Ross, is just as self-evident as some sort of mathematical or logical proposition. Again, the kind of analogy that Ross gives here is the analogy of, just as an example, some sort of logical truth of inference. If, for example, all A's are B's and all B's are C's, then what can we conclude logically from that? Clearly, we can conclude that all A's are C's. That is a self-evident truth. You do not appeal to something outside those first two propositions or statements to arrive at that conclusion. Rather, once you achieve a certain amount of mental acuity, once you become old enough to reason or think properly, you can intuitively see that if all A's are B's and all B's are C's, then logically it follows that all A's are C's. One thing that we need to keep clear with respect to Ross is that he believes that there's no set ranking to the prima facie duties. We've listed them in a particular way, and we've said in our specific theoretical scenario that there is, at least from Ross's perspective or PHIL's perspective, the proper way to rank those prima facie duties. But that ranking may change. In one context, your obligation may be to tell the truth. In another situation, it may be overridden by a duty of justice, to be fair, or it may be overridden by a duty of reparation to correct a past wrong. So, although they're all prima facie duties, we have to understand that ultimately it's going to be up to our intuitions to decide in any given dilemma or scenario which prima facie duty takes priority. The criteria for when a prima facie duty becomes an actual duty is when the prima facie duty is not in conflict with other duties. In other words, if you find yourself in a situation and you're confronted with a dilemma where you've got to do the right thing and the right thing is defined in terms of justice and it's not in conflict with any other duty or obligation, in effect you don't even have a dilemma. You have a specific prima facie duty that immediately becomes your actual duty. But if you're in a situation or a scenario where you have a dilemma, where you have two of these duties in conflict with one another, or a trilemma, you have three of these different duties in conflict with one another, it's at that point that upon appeal to your intuitions, you must decide which prima facie duty takes priority. The one that takes priority in that specific situation, the one that you must do, goes from being merely a prima facie duty to becoming, again, an actual duty. So when do prima facie duties become actual duties? Well, when they're the only one, or when the superseding prima facie duty overrides, supersedes, or trumps all conflicting lower prima facie duties. So what kinds of duties are there? Prima facie, first glance, and actual. The etymology, again by way of review for the prima facie duties, first face, first glance. In a given scenario or situation, you're going to be confronted potentially with several conflicting moral obligations arrived at intuitively. They're just self-evident. They're conditional truths. An example might be, I've got a moral obligation to keep a promise. An actual duty is the prima facie duty that one should perform. It becomes your must. Your duty, what you must perform. A prima facie duty is the actual duty if it's not in conflict with any other prima facie duties or it supersedes all other prima facie duties. Just looking at a specific example, say that you promise to meet a specific professor here at Chattanooga State at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But while you're driving to meet this professor, and you'll be on time if you don't dilly-dally, if you hurry to your professor's office, you encounter someone who's crashed their car into a tree. This person is bleeding out. This person needs assistance. So you have two prima facie duties here. You have the duty of fidelity, and you also have the duty of beneficence that are in conflict with one another. You can't perform them both. Kant would say, well, you have a duty to do both of these. Ross says we have to understand that duties are oftentimes in conflict with one another, and we need to pick which one trumps or overrides or supersedes the other. Which one is more important in this context? Which one trumps the other? According to Ross, it would be simple. You have to stop and help the person. It doesn't mean that you didn't have an obligation to keep your promise to meet the professor at a specific moment in time, but it's being trumped, it's being overridden. Your actual duty is to stop and help.
Many individuals would say that the preceding is directly related to natural law theory. Recall that natural law has two meanings. There's a broad concept of natural law. This is the natural law as described by C.S. Lewis. The broad notion is simply that all have a basic notion of what is right and wrong. The moral principles are intuitively obvious. This view might assert that a basic understanding of the moral principles is simply part of the fabric of the universe. This is something that all have access to from a theological perspective. In truth, this is simply part of what is meant by general revelation. As Lewis sees it, we are born with an innate sense of what is right that implies the existence of God. The narrower sense would be an Aristotelian sense. The narrower sense can be found in the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. Here, knowing something specifically with respect to human nature in the sense of telos and purpose as defined by God can help us determine naturally what is right and what is wrong. Ross's duties appear to really be the principles of a broad understanding of natural law. What Ross is saying is, I think, a lot closer to what Lewis would say. We have this innate sense of what is right and what is wrong. Ross builds upon this notion by pointing out that these moral obligations will oftentimes be in conflict with one another. When this happens, we also have to appeal to our intuitions to decide which one trumps or overrides the lower or lesser moral duties.
Now, of course, this position is not without its potential detractors. By way of evaluation, some people are going to say the following. They're going to say, well, listen, these duties are not self-evident. It's not self-evidently obvious. It's not an intuition that we have to have this duty of justice or have to have this duty of reparation, that's first face or first glance something that just everybody knows is true. Well, Audi gives a response to this. He points out quickly that we need to understand really what is meant by self-evident. Oftentimes individuals take self-evident to just mean obvious, or that this is just something that everybody knows. It's self-evident that such and such is the case. Well, if you look at the term, or if you look at the phrase itself, you have to understand that self-evident means two things. It means, first of all, that the proposition grounds itself, which is merely to say that it is known directly. It's not something that's based on some other principle. It evidences itself. In other words, the proposition is not inferred. It's not based on some other principle. Appeal to Ross at this point. Remember that in the previous quotation that I gave with respect to Ross, what Ross said self-evident meant was it is evident without any need of proof or evidence beyond itself. So self-evident does not mean obvious. Self-evident doesn't mean that everybody knows it. Self-evident doesn't mean that you know it immediately when you think about it. It simply means that it is justified without any need of proof. Or perhaps a better way to refer to it, it is a warranted belief without need of justification. So Ross said explicitly, self-evident propositions, like these prima facie duties, are evident without any need of proof or evidence beyond themselves. According to Audi, we need to be clear as to what self-evidence does not mean. First of all, to say that something is self-evident does not mean that it is known by everybody. Secondly, it doesn't even mean that the proposition is known to be self-evident. Thirdly, self-evident does not mean that the proposition is known immediately, nor does it mean that the proposition is incapable of being proven, or that the proposition cannot be denied. Self-evident, again, by way of review, merely means that it grounds itself, that it constitutes evidence for itself. Just look at the two words or the two parts of that word, self-evident. And secondly, that it's not inferred. So the proposition that you have some kind of a moral obligation to keep your promise is self-evident, not in the sense in which everybody knows this, or that they know that this is just self-evident, or that you know this immediately, or that you can't prove it, or that it can't be denied. Self-evident means none of those things. First of all, we need to pay particular close attention to that first claim. Self-evident, according to Audi and others, does not mean that the proposition is known by all. Even Ross made mention of that. Remember, going back to what we read before, Ross was explicit in stating that it is Self-evident in the sense that when we have reached sufficient mental maturity and have given sufficient attention to the proposition, we see it as self-evident. It doesn't mean that somebody who's 3 years of age is going to know that they have some kind of a duty of justice. Nor does it mean that an individual who hasn't used their mind or hasn't thought about it is necessarily going to have an awareness of that principle. Self-evident, again, only means that it evidences itself and that it's not grounded, or that it doesn't have to be grounded, in some other proposition. Another issue that we need to keep in mind with respect to what is and is not meant by self-evidence is that we need to remember that self-evidence does not mean that the proposition is known immediately. This is perhaps the biggest confusion associated with self-evidence. If someone says that a claim or that a statement or a proposition is self-evident, a lot of people think that that means, well, you just know it immediately and it comes to you without any thought at all. That's not what it means. It does not mean that the proposition is known immediately. Here Audi might be helpful. Audi states the following: one can fail initially to see a self-evident truth, yet later grasp it in just the way one grasps again the truth of a paradigmatically self-evident proposition, one obvious in itself the moment we consider it. Take, for example, and I think that this is really a good example that helps explain how even if something is self-evident, that doesn't mean that it doesn't require a certain amount of thought to see that it is self-evident. Remember, self-evident only means that it grounds itself. A self-evident proposition that is perhaps not immediately obvious. The existence of great-grandchildren is impossible apart from that of 4 generations of people. The existence of great-grandchildren is impossible apart from that of 4 generations of people. You know that that is true on the basis of those terms or those words involved in that specific proposition. Logically, you have to unpack how many generations would be necessary in order for great-grandchildren to exist. It takes some thought, in other words, at least for most individuals, to arrive at the conclusion that that would require 4 generations of people. And yet you know that is true from a self-evident perspective. It doesn't mean that you can't look at individuals and count up 4 generations of people and say, behold, that last generation contains great-grandchildren of the first generation, but that would only confirm something that you already know on the basis of logic or reason. The statement or the proposition that the existence of great-grandchildren is impossible from that of 4 generations of people is known in a self-evident sort of way. That proposition constitutes its own evidence. You need not appeal to specific individuals to know that that proposition is true. Beyond that, you know that that proposition is necessarily true, and that would certainly never be something that would be possible to conclude on the basis of looking at specific people. A delay in seeing something, such as the truth of this, need not change the character of what one sees. So again, keep in mind, what does it mean to say that these duties about which Ross is speaking are self-evident? It merely means that they constitute their own evidence. It merely means that they're not inferred from something else. It does not mean that they're known immediately. It doesn't mean that everybody knows them. It doesn't even mean that everybody knows that these are self-evident truths. It just means that their truth is like the truth of logic or mathematics, and that it grounds itself. Well, a second objection that one could raise here is that the duties are groundless. The response that Audi and others might give to this objection would be, first of all, to assert that self-evident principles are not grounded in other beliefs. To require that a moral duty is grounded in something is to misunderstand its nature. If something is self-evident, it doesn't require grounding. It doesn't have to be justified by anything else because it constitutes the justification for itself. It would be like asking that somebody prove an axiom in geometry, or that someone prove that if all A's are B's and all B's are C's, that all A's are C's. You can't prove those principles. I could perhaps confirm them in experience. I could perhaps show you every other time that I've looked at a situation where all A's are B's and all B's are C's that yes, it turns out that all those A's are C's as well. But that doesn't establish the principle. That confirms it. That shows me that perhaps this is backing up the claim that I've made previously. But that doesn't establish the claim. That just shows that in this particular situation, in this particular circumstance, it works. It would be akin to an axiom in geometry like the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. You don't prove that principle by drawing two points on a sheet of paper and connecting them and seeing that, behold, it ends up being a straight line. The axiom is the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. So it doesn't matter how many points you draw and how many straight lines that you end up drawing between those 2 points, you don't establish that the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. You certainly establish that the shortest distance between these 2 points is a straight line, but the axiomatic principle is a principle in the sense in which it applies all the time. It's presumably this necessary truth, not a truth that can just be confirmed once, but a truth that would apply to all specific instances. So what that means is that to claim or to argue that Ross has to ground these self-evident truths, or that anybody has to ground or prove them, is to misunderstand. That's the kind of objection that you ask with respect to potentially groundable propositions. If something is not a self-evident truth, if it doesn't evidence itself, then you do have to provide evidence for it. Evidence outside of itself. You have to give some sort of inference. You have to show how it can be derived from some other principle. But if something is self-evident, to ask, well, what's the evidence for it outside of itself, is to misunderstand what it means to say that a proposition or a principle is self-evident. Beyond that, some individuals have argued that it actually might be possible to ground these duties. Ross doesn't seem to think that it's necessary, and if something's self-evident, it doesn't have to be necessary. He doesn't think that you can prove them, but it may be possible to provide evidence or proof for even self-evident principles. How might I be able to do that? Well, I might be able to ground these duties in Kant's principle of ends. What I mean by that is this. Think back to our discussion of the relationship between God and humanity, where our value comes from. Whether it be on the basis of some kind of intuition like Kant's principle of ends, or on the basis of thinking that we just simply know from a theistic perspective, somebody might argue, that humans are intrinsically valuable. Once you grant that proposition, once you grant that belief that humans are, for all practical purposes, intrinsically valuable, it seems likely that these principles about which Ross speaks would make sense, that I have an obligation not to lie to somebody, that I have an obligation to be just or to be fair, that I have an obligation to correct past wrongs or to provide some kind of reparation if I've hurt or harmed somebody in the past. Why? Well, because these individuals should be treated as ends and not as means only. A lot of individuals, just by way of summary, think that Ross's response does a really good way of bridging the gulf or the gap between Butler on the one hand, who perhaps intuitively understands that there is this notion that we can ground these principles in self-evident notions, but also in Kant as well, that we can understand that these are not merely actions that we need to perform that can be known in terms of our intuitions or our conscience, but that we're dealing with principles here. A lot of people believe that Ross does a good job of bridging the gulf or gap between Ross and Kant, and providing an exceptional way of determining what is right and what is wrong. You need to act in accordance with specific duties or obligations, but contrary to what Kant said, that doesn't mean that these duties or obligations are absolutes. It doesn't mean that you're doing the wrong thing when you tell a lie, for example, if and only if that moral obligation is being overridden by a higher moral obligation.